Joy and Radiance. Deep among the shadow of the darkest wood, past the gnarled roots of even the oldest trees, through ageless mists and timeless groves, there lived a creature. Its hair, the canopy of the tallest tree, broad and dark. Its twisted nose an iron hook. Its chin a dried-up, coiled root. Its right eye sparkled like the North Star on a moonless night, darting in its socket, always looking, always searching. Where once its left eye dwelt was a black pit, darker than midnight. In that socket lived the horror of eternity, the blackness from which we all have come, and the blackness to which we all, kicking and cursing, return. Not just the absence of light, but the absence of everything. The tempered chaos of nothing. Its body twisted like the trunks of petrified trees, pitted and scarred. Its feet matted turf wedded to the soil. Its arms were dried, withered branches. At the end of its arms were fingers, sharp and pointed as pine needles, but as hard as iron. This creature was hate. It hated all things, but most of all, it hated love. Its purpose was to purge the world of love in all its forms, to strike it out. All who saw this fiend were doomed to live out the rest of their short and heavy lives, consumed with hate, the slave of hate. Plunging its fingers into the chest of all who entered into its black kingdom, it is said it pulled out their hearts and replaced the living heart with cold, black, dead rock, a black stone that forever robbed that poor soul of love, filled them with the leaden burden of despair, a weight too heavy for even the strongest man to carry, an icy, all-consuming gloom that left their soul to wither on the bough. It is also said that there lived a keeper of the light, human but not human, a being possessed of the light of love that lives in all our hearts, able to wield it like a sword to strike out darkness wherever they found it. It is said that light and dark would one day meet, and a ferocious battle would ensue, and the fate of the world for good or ill would be decided on that day. At the edge of a wood, in a primrose-scented meadow, in an ivy-covered cottage, lived a woodcutter and his wife. The woodcutter was a broad, hearty man, with a great appetite and a booming laugh that bounced off the walls of the valley. His wife was a slender, willowy woman with hazel eyes and rich chestnut hair. Her laugh was like birdsong or a tinkling bell. And laughing at night in front of the hearth, their combined melodies danced with one another in perfect harmony. Their life was a peaceful, happy one, full of laughter and song. The only thing missing was children to share their happiness with. Until one day, arriving home after a hard day working, the woodcutter was greeted at the door by his beautiful wife rushing into his arms and saying, "Oh, husband, I am so happy, for we are going to have children." And the woodcutter guffawed his throaty roar, and his wife chuckled her ringing bell, and they danced around the kitchen and all night drank wine and were merry. Summer turned into winter, and winter turned into spring, and all this time the woodcutter's wife grew rounder. Her belly swelled, and every morning she would look down at her thickening waist and say, "Soon you will see the sun rise. Soon you will see the sun set. Soon you will see the world." It was on a spring morning that not one, but 2 daughters were born to the woodcutter and his wife. When the first child was born, she didn't scream like other babies did on their first breath of the world, but she looked up at her father with bright blue eyes, smiled at him, and then started to laugh. Her father joined in with his firstborn and said, "You have brought even more happiness to this house and to your mother and me by your laughter, and so I will call you Joy." The newly christened Joy laughed to hear her new name, and her mother and father laughed with her. No sooner had he said this than the woodcutter's second-born joined her sister in the carnival of life. "My lord," said her father, "you have a head of golden hair, the likes of which I've never seen." It was true that the baby was born with golden tresses as thick on her head as a child of 5, and the infant's hair shone with an inner glow that rivaled the sun. "For the brightness you bring to the world and to my heart, I shall call you Radiance." And so joy and radiance came into the world. One day, when the 2 sisters were barely 3 years old, the woodcutter's wife said to her husband, "Can you watch the children, for I must get some water from the stream just inside the wood." She walked into the wood and didn't return home for 3 days and nights, and when she returned, such a change was wrought in her that she was almost unrecognizable. Where once there lived a smile, lived a scowl. Where once an embrace, a turned shoulder. She would never speak of where she had spent those 3 days. But it seemed to the woodcutter that something had happened to her that had drained her of all love, not just for him, but for their beautiful daughters. She could hardly bear to look at them. From the day of her return, she grew steadily weaker, always complaining of the heaviness of her heart. She labored and declined until one day the woodcutter knew it was her last. As she passed out of this world, she looked into the eyes of her husband, a grimace making a mockery of her face, and said, "I have a black stone in my chest that has weighed me down and brought me to this dread day. I do not love you. At the last, I hate." Her eyes dimmed and she was dead. Many years passed and both sisters grew up to be happy and healthy. Their father never told them what had become of their mother, simply saying that God had taken her one night and that his wisdom was his own. The little ivy-covered cottage in the meadow on the edge of the wood was as happy a place as any in the world, and only at night, when the sisters were in bed, would the woodcutter think on his wife, on what she had said, and hope that it hadn't been true. In the sisters' 15th year, the summer was viciously hot. Every day the sun would rise heavily into the sky and cover the earth in a damp blanket of heat. One morning, Radiance was in the kitchen up to her elbows in flour, baking bread for dinner that night. The woodcutter was busy splitting logs to sell at the local market. With every axe blow, the chopping block would be splashed by a healthy spray of his sweat. Joy was laying in the long grass at the end of their garden, on her back, watching a flock of swallows swoop and dive, enraptured by their movements in the sky, gasping at their beauty and laughing with their song. Her father looked over and thought, "Here we are working on this sweltering day, and Joy is just lying there looking at the birds." He looked over at the pail, lay in the grass, empty, and called to Joy. "My love, will you go to the stream just inside the tree line and fetch a pail of water?" The young girl leapt to her feet and said, "With pleasure, father. I will run faster than the flight of a swallow." And with a peal of laughter, she galloped across the meadow towards the wood. "Just go inside the tree line and call if you see anything in the wood," her father yelled after her. "Don't worry, father, I will." The shade of the trees was cool, and the wood smelt of fallen leaves. She could hear the sound of the water falling over the rocks, and walked over to the stream. She took a handful of the icy water and gulped it down. It was only as she drank that she realized how thirsty she was. She drank her fill and started to fill the bucket. It was then that she heard a sound. She turned but saw nothing. "Don't be frightened, child." The voice seemed to come from everywhere. From the rustle of the leaves, from the chirrup of the birds. "Who's there?" "You have no need to fear." As if from nowhere, a tall woman appeared, dressed in head to toe in the richest fabrics that Joy had ever seen. Her emerald eyes sparkled, and raven black hair fell to her shoulders in glimmering locks. "Hello, child," said the woman. "I've never seen you here before." "No, I don't come into the woods very much. My father doesn't like it." "Why ever not? The wood is the most magical place in the world. I can show you its secrets if you like." and the woman beamed a broad grin. Joy was captivated by her beauty. "I would like that very much, but my father told me to come straight back." "Nonsense. It will take no time at all." The woman held out her slender fingers, long and ivory, white tipped with long scarlet fingernails. "If you promise that we're quick," said Joy. She stood up. "Oh, we will be quick," said the woman. Joy took the lady's hand. The fingers were stone cold. "Come with me, child." Suddenly Joy could see into the heart of the woman. It was black as pitch. She could see the hate pumping through her veins. She pulled her hand back sharply. "What's the matter, dear?" said the woman. Her voice was starting to rasp. "What are you?" Joy said. "Come with me, child." The voice now had lost any of its softness. Joy watched as the woman's fingernails became longer and thinner like needles, and the fabric of her dress turned into hard, pitted skin like the bark of a tree. She turned and fled as fast as she could into the wood, and heard an unnatural scream behind her. After 30 minutes, the woodcutter looked up from his work. "Where is that girl?" he said to himself. He walked to the back of the house and looked into the kitchen, where his other daughter was working, her hair tied up into a thick scarf. "Radiance, have you seen your sister?" "No, father, I haven't seen her since this morning. Is she not with you?" "She's gone into the woods to fetch me some water, but hasn't returned yet. Put down your things and come and help me look." So the woodcutter and his daughter set off to look for Joy. They searched the house from top to bottom. No Joy. They scoured every inch of the garden and surrounding meadow. No Joy. After 2 hours of searching, the woodcutter was frantic. "Radiance," the woodcutter said to his daughter, "you stay here and wait and see if she comes back. I will go and look for her in the woods." The woodcutter tramped off into the woods, and Radiance sat back on the chopping block to wait for her sister. 1 hour went by, nothing. 2 hours and still nothing. Radiance started to worry that both of them were never coming back. She walked to the tree line. "Father!" she shouted, but there was no answer. "Joy!" There was nothing but silence. She was about to turn back towards the house when she heard, as faint as the squeak of a mouse, "Radiance, is that you?" "That's Joy," she thought to herself. "Joy? Radiance, you must help me." "But what is wrong, Joy?" "Please come and help me." She wanted to wait for her father, but if Joy was in trouble, she would have to go to her. "I'm coming, Joy. Please come quickly." She ran into the woods towards the voice. "Quickly, Radiance, quickly!" The trees became thicker and thicker, and Radiance ran faster and faster towards her sister's voice. The trees ended, and she stood in a clearing. In this clearing stood a cottage. The cottage was old and derelict, with creepers growing through the gables. "Joy? Just in here, Radiance." The voice was coming from the cottage. "Father!" she yelled at the top of her voice. "Father, I found Joy!" "Radiance, please help me, I'm in so much pain." She pushed the door open, and in the middle of the floor, Joy sat holding her foot. "Please come and help me, Radiance. I fell over whilst getting water and managed to crawl in here. I called for help, but nobody heard me. Help me up and we'll go home." Radiance was nervous about going into the cottage without her father, but she had to help her sister. She walked over to her and helped her up. Her sister's eyes flashed and she grinned. "Thank you, sister," she said, her voice beginning to crackle. "You have my thanks, and now I shall have your heart." Before her eyes, Joy transformed into an 8-foot-tall creature. It had one eye and its body was scarred. Its fingers stretched into points and became sharper needles. It grinned at her. "I took your mother's heart, and now I shall have yours." Radiance threw her head back and screamed. As she did this, the scarf fell from her head, and her hair fell in streams about her shoulders. It was as if 1,000 candles had been lit in that small cottage. The creature dropped the girl to the floor and staggered backwards, trying in vain to shield its eyes. The creature let out a piercing scream that rattled the shutters in the little cottage. A blinding white flash. The creature disappeared as if engulfed by light, leaving nothing but a perfectly round and polished black stone in the centre of the room. Drawn by the scream, the woodcutter found Radiance crouched in the corner of the cottage in floods of tears. He touched her on the shoulder. "My love," he said tenderly. "What's the matter?" "Joy is gone. I couldn't stop that creature from taking her away." The woodcutter put his arms around her. "She hasn't gone anywhere, my love. I found her lost in the forest. She could see the creature for what it was inside, and whatever it was, it's gone now. The light of your heart has destroyed it." They left the cottage in the woods and went back to their own. Many years later, when Joy and Radiance had children of their own, and their father passed away, they moved from the primrose-scented meadow to the town and left the grass to grow over their father's grave. But they never forgot the cottage in the woods, and when one day Radiance, his oldest son, pointed to the perfectly round and polished black stone that his mother kept on the mantelpiece and asked what it was, Radiance smiled and said, "A reminder." The end.